All right, welcome. Today, we are diving into a pretty big question about religious thought. What happens when you decide to strip everything back to just a single source? We're going to explore a philosophical framework within Islam that does exactly that. So, I really want to start with this question right here, because it gets to the absolute heart of what we're talking about. What would it actually mean if one single text, the Quran, was the exclusive guide for an entire religious and philosophical system? That's the core idea we're going to unpack. So, okay, let's start with the absolute basics. What in the world is Quranism? Now, it's important to know we're not talking about a new sect or denomination here. It's more of a specific framework, a distinct approach to understanding. At its very core, Quranism is what you'd call an epistemological framework. Now, that sounds super academic, I know, but all it really means is it's a system for how we know what we know. And in this particular system, the Quran is put on a pedestal as the one and only authoritative source for divine revelation. Everything else, it's secondary. So you might be wondering, okay, but why? Why take this approach? Well, the central argument boils down to one word: coherence. The philosophy here suggests that the Quran has its own built-in logic, its own complete message. And when you start adding other sources into the mix, you run the risk of, well, muddying the waters, disrupting that clarity, and maybe even introducing contradictions. And that brings us to a really crucial concept, this idea of an epistemological hierarchy. In simple terms, it's just about ranking your sources of knowledge. Which one do you trust the most? Which one has the final say? Let's see how that plays out. So in this framework, the Quran sits at the very, very top of the pyramid. And the reasoning is pretty straightforward. It's believed to be the direct, unfiltered word of God. And because of that, it's seen as the primary and, this is the key word, the only infallible source. And this slide, wow, it just lays out the difference so clearly. On the one hand, you have traditional scholarship, which builds its understanding on a combination of sources. The Quran, yes, but also the Hadith, which are the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, and scholarly consensus. But then on the other side, you see the Quranism framework, which just radically simplifies things down to one source: the Quran, period. So the real point of divergence is this. From this particular perspective, relying on those extra sources, no matter how valuable they might seem, basically opens the door for human error. It's seen as the way that our own subjective takes and, the cultural biases of a specific time and place can creep in and maybe cloud that original divine message. This leads us straight into another foundational idea for this framework, and that's the need to draw a really sharp, clear line in the sand between what is universal religion and what is just local culture. And this is a huge deal. The whole argument is that over hundreds of years, a lot of practices that are just cultural, specific to a certain time or a certain place, have gotten mixed up with what's considered core religious doctrine. This framework is all about trying to untangle those two. So what does that look like in the real world? Well, think about stuff like specific styles of music or traditional clothing or social customs from one particular part of the world. From this viewpoint, these things aren't universal religious rules. They're what you'd call cultural artifacts. They might be beautiful and meaningful for sure, but they're separate from the timeless doctrine in the Quran. And the big implication here is that faith can then be expressed authentically in any culture, not just one. And the whole goal of drawing this line so carefully is to try and isolate what is believed to be the timeless, universal message of the Quran. The idea is that if you can separate it from all the cultural baggage, the core message can then apply to anyone, anywhere, at any point in history. Okay. Now, you might be thinking that if you rely on a single ancient text, you're going to end up with a really rigid, unchanging way of thinking. But this framework actually argues for the complete opposite. It suggests something way more dynamic. And that's the natural question, isn't it? If the source code is locked, does that mean the program can never, ever be updated? And the answer, from this point of view, is a definite not at all. Instead of an interpretation that's set in stone, it pushes for a dynamic one, an understanding that's actually meant to grow and evolve right alongside our collective human knowledge, especially as science and philosophy move forward. This process right here is everything. You start with the foundation that never changes, the Quranic text itself. Then you look at it through the lens of everything we are learning today, all our advancing knowledge in science and other fields, and the result isn't changing the text, but constantly refining and deepening how we understand it. And the whole point of this is relevance. It's an approach that's designed to make sure the Quranic message isn't just seen as some historical document, but as something that can speak directly to the challenges we face right now, from modern ethics to big philosophical questions. Okay, so let's pull back and look at the big picture for a second. What does all this really mean for how you even think about Islam itself? This comparison really hits the nail on the head. You could see Islam as, well, as history, a set of rituals and practices that are forever tied to a specific historical time and place, like 7th century Arabia. Or you can see it through the lens of this framework, as a living philosophy. And that means a continuous, ongoing conversation with the core text, one that's always informed by our most current understanding of the world. And this leads us to a really powerful idea from the source material. This approach frames Islam not as something static or frozen in time, but as a living, evolving philosophy, one that is fully capable of taking on the complex challenges of our modern world. So if you take one thing away from our explainer today, let it be this. The Quranist framework isn't really about digging up a fixed set of answers from the past. It's about committing to an ongoing process of understanding, looking at a core text through the always improving lens of human knowledge. And that kind of leaves us with a final thought, one that goes way beyond just this one topic. What happens to our relationship with any foundational text, whether it's religious or philosophical or even constitutional, when we stop seeing it as a relic and start treating it as a living document, something whose meaning can evolve right along with us? It's a really powerful question to think about. Thanks so much for joining us.